All right. Welcome, everybody. Good morning for those of you guys joining us from New Haven or the East Coast. Good evening for those of you joining us from Asia. And I suppose it's possible that you're joining us from somewhere else. So hello to the rest of you as well. My name is Devin Lau. I'm the Associate Director for Yale Center Beijing, and I am hosting our talk today. We're very excited to welcome back Denise Lady. She is the Ruth and Bruce Dayton Curator of Asian Art at the Yale University Art Gallery. She's a graduate of Columbia, but she's also served as the Brooke Russell Astor Curator of Asian Art Emerita at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, as well as in curatorial positions at the Asia Society in New York and the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. She's endlessly fascinated by the development and movement of technologies, ideas, and images within and between Asian cultures, and between these centers and those in Africa, Europe, and the Americas. In addition to curating exhibitions, she's also published and lectured widely, exploring topics including Buddhist art, Chinese and Asian ceramics, as well as East Asian lacquer. She's published many articles and books uh, spanning a lot of different topics. Her most recent book, of course, being Celadon on the Seas, Chinese Ceramics, from the 9th to the 14th century, which she also was kind enough to give a talk on as well a few months ago. And so we're happy to welcome her back to talk about her latest interests and her latest research, and that's about white clay, Chinese ceramics, and Eurasian exchanges. And so with that, I will turn things over to her.
So thank you everyone for coming, especially those of you that are up early in the morning, including me. So something fascinating happened in China in the late 6th century, which is that they changed the kind of clay they were using, and they went from sort of a low-fired red clay to a high-fired white clay. And this had a profound impact on ceramics in West Asia and in the Eastern Mediterranean. And so the story I'm kind of working on developing is, I think of it more as like waves going back and forth rather than things going in a straight line. And it is a complicated story with a lot of side avenues. So I'm going to give you an overview of this story, and then I'm going to give you two byways and one epilogue so that I can get most of the ideas in, even though I can't get them in quite in a straight line. So the first question we need to answer is why? Why did people change the type of clay that they were using? Now, most of our information about ceramics from this point in time comes from two sources. One is archaeology, because there so much, as many as I suspect all of you know, has been excavated in China in the last 30 years. And the other is the development of non-invasive testing of materials, which is something that has happened in museums around the world, including in Shanghai, for example, where we are able now, without taking a sample out of an object, to really understand how it was made. So we know that the white clay that popped up mysteriously has a high percentage of a material called, in English, kaolin, and in Chinese, gaoling, and it's basically the primary ingredient in porcelain. So one of the reasons for beginning to choose this clay clearly was that it was a more plastic clay, it was a finer clay, and it could be high fired. It's also true that when you look through tombs from the last quarter of the 6th century, which is when we begin to see white clay, um, a large number of tombs featuring white clay, but not all of them, it becomes clear that there seems to have been some kind of taste or choice on the part of the tomb inhabitant for this material. So I'm showing you three things from the tomb of Zhang Sheng, who died in 595. And in that tomb, you find tomb figures and containers, the kinds of things that you would find in almost any tomb. You also find objects such as this chessboard that are very, very much reflective of his taste and the kinds of things that he felt he needed in his afterlife. And there are a significant number of objects in this tomb which really suggest that he was aware of a broader world and very interested in things from other places. Probably the best example of this is this ewer, which I'm showing you on the left at the moment, which has an elephant spout, a dragon handle, and these very, I suspect, non-functional lugs decorating the shoulders or the neck of the ewer. This is unusual in Chinese ceramic history for many, many reasons. First of all, it's a one-off. It's unique. I have been unable, and I have looked, to find anything else that looks like this anywhere in China from the same point in time. I've also been unable to find it elsewhere. The closest parallel I can find is the bronze pouring vessel, which I'm showing you on the right, which also has an elephant spout and more or less the same bulbous shape. That vessel is generally cataloged as Vietnamese and dates to the 2nd or 3rd century AD. So it's several hundred years earlier than the piece in the tomb that we're looking at. I have no answer for this. It's just something I don't understand, because either the bronze vessel is something that was found in South China and preserved in Vietnam, which is possible because in the Han Dynasty, Vietnam was under Chinese rule, or there were more of these things kicking around and he had seen one somewhere and wanted to preserve them, or I don't understand this story at all. Any of those options are possible. You also find in his tomb these delicate little trays with round feet. This is a new shape in Chinese ceramics. It is definitely a shape that was introduced from outside. It probably comes from either Sogdia or from the Sasanians, so it's from the greater West Asian world. It is something that is closer in time to the late 6th century in China, and it is the type of thing that is found repeatedly in Chinese ceramics and metalwork from the 6th to the 8th century, often accompanied by small cups, probably for serving wine, and then a little dish of some sort for serving some kind of a sweet. So if I'm trying to figure out, and I am, why white clay sort of pops up in China, one of the things to do is look for things that might have inspired the taste for white clay. And so I started looking around for more parallels in shapes and designs. And the thing that I can find the most of are these small white cups, which were made from this beautiful, very high-fired white clay in the Sui and the Tang Dynasty, often in sets. They are made primarily in clay, but you also find them in Chinese glass. And interestingly enough, they have prototypes or parallels in what we call Roman glass. Now, that's a bit of a misnomer. Roman glass was one of the great luxuries of the ancient Eurasian world. It was found in Europe. It's found throughout, obviously, the Eastern Mediterranean, but it's also been found in Xinjiang, in China, and in significant quantities in South Korea. And it's possible that this shape was inspired by these imported goods that came in, because both the shape and the white clay sort of pop up in the late 6th century. And an argument for the fact that the Chinese were aware of Roman glass and looking at it is found in the development of sansai about 100 years later than the first use of white clay. Now, sansai, or three-color glazes, as you all know, have three colors: green, amber, and white. The green and the amber are found as early as the Han Dynasty. The white is the new color. So it is the choice of white 100 years earlier that makes it possible to do the three-color glazes around 675 AD. So 100 years after the beginning of the use of white clay. And just very, very quickly, and I can do this innumerable times, if you look at the patterning and the surface effects that you find in Roman or West Asian glass, and the surface effects that you find in Chinese sansai ware, you can see similarities in streaking in mosaic-like patterns, and in using clay and glass to actually imitate the surface effects of semi-precious stones. So my theory at the moment is that Sansai, which seems to have appeared almost miraculously, like from the head of a god, right? All of a sudden, people have totally changed what they're doing with glazes and they're splashing them, kind of like Jackson Pollock on the surface of clay. That Sansai may have been made as a competition initially for Roman glass. So we're going from the 6th to the 7th to the 8th century. White is the through line, and white clay is developing. It's becoming also moving, clay in general is moving away from funerary context and becoming much more part of an elegant lifestyle. So that by the time you get to the Tang Dynasty, people are writing poems about ceramics and they're writing connoisseurship about ceramics. What are the best ceramics? What are the ceramics you should use for drinking tea? What are the ceramics you should use for drinking wine? And by the time you get to our friend Wei Tsung, you can see clearly that white ceramics are part, very, very much part of an elegant lifestyle. They're also developing, so the clay, which is inherently plastic, as I remembered, has allowed people to make thinner and thinner ceramics. It's also allowed people to shape ceramics with points and lobes that you need a very strong clay to make. And so they are a technical, logical marvel in the sort of late ancient or early medieval world. And they are traveling. Ceramics that are being made in northern China, while they are not as ubiquitous as the green glazed wares that are being made in the south, are moving both across the Silk Road, so they're moving overland, and they're also moving by sea. They have been found as far west, again in very, very small numbers, as far west as Egypt and as far east as Japan. And everywhere they go, they're causing a lot of interest. At the same time, Sansai, which we think of as a primarily a burial good, is also found in the same context with the same things. And you can go from a piece of Roman glass to a Chinese ceramic with a three-color glaze imitating the shape of a piece of Roman glass to an Islamic dish imitating the surface effect of a Sansai ware. You can also start looking at numerous attempts in the greater West Asian world to imitate the impact of these very, very rare, extremely elegant early Chinese whitewares. And to just give you one example of this, in the 7th and 8th century, there was a ruler, the 5th Abbasid caliph named Harun al-Rashid, who received a gift of 2,000 Chinese ceramics from someone who was obviously trying to establish diplomatic ties with him. 20 of those pieces were Chinese whitewares, which shows how rare and valuable they were in the world at the time. And they spurred the development of a technology in West Asia, which served ultimately to redefine ceramics in the Eastern Mediterranean and Europe. So this is our Chinese piece that we were just looking at. And since I am talking to a Yale crowd, this is my showing off. This is a recent gift from an alumni. It's an example of Xingware. It is on view in the galleries if you want to see it. And if you look at the back of it, you can see that the clay itself, in addition to the glaze, is basically white, and that it's a very, very thin and very strong clay. It's also, not surprisingly, because when you fire a ceramic and the glaze and the clay meld and they vitrify, as it's called, it becomes more hygienic because it's cleaner. The piece that you're looking at on your right is an example of the tin glazing that developed in the ancient world, in an ancient Western Asian world, in an attempt to imitate the appearance of Chinese ceramics. So the clay in this case is not white. It's actually a light buff color, which they've then covered completely with a off-white glaze that has been made thicker and whiter by adding some combination of tin and other elements to the glaze or to the surface covering. And then, of course, they painted it in a splash design in blue and green, which imitates, again, to a certain extent, this taste for white that's developing throughout the Asian world. Over time and very, very quickly. So the tin glazing was developed in the 8th and the 9th century. In the 9th and the 10th century, Islamic ceramics developed another technology, which is called luster. It developed first in Egypt and then went back into Iran and Iraq. In luster, you cover the ceramic with a tin glaze. You paint the design on it. You cover it with a transparent glaze. You fire it. You then repaint the design on it using metallic oxides, and you fire it again so that it has the surface effect of metal or glass. So this 9th or 10th century Egyptian piece actually shows us a Coptic priest with a censer or an incense burner and an ankh that has been turned into a cross, which is very typical of sort of Coptic imagery. And the Iraqi ceramic shows you a very Sasanian Sogdian figure. Sort of, it should remind you of the wall painting we saw in the beginning of the talk, where you see a person seated with his legs crossed in front of him, holding vessels and drinking. Generally, the Iranian ones are a little bit yellower looking in their luster than the Egyptian ones. In all cases, these are very, very expensive, highly finished ceramics that have been decorated both on the inside and the outside, and were probably the luxury goods of the time. And so all of this technology, which is developing in Egypt and further off where I don't have a map, here eventually moves into northern Africa and into southern Spain, which, as I'm sure many of you know, had Islamic kingdoms for a very long period of time. And you get tin glaze ceramics developing initially in the Cordoba region and then later in Granada. And this is exactly the same technology that was developed in the West Asian world in imitation of Chinese whiteware. So you have a tin glazed ceramic. It is painted with copper and magnesium. So the primary colorants are green and a kind of a purplish brown. And this is called in Spanish verde y magnesio, vert et brun in French, and something else in Italian. This becomes the European technology from the sort of 9th to the 11th century. As you can see, we have a shared visual language as well. So the bottle has a procession of musicians, and both the plate and the storage jar have inscriptions in them that are actually written in Kufic and in Arabic, which tell us, which offer, they're usually things like they either say kingship or dominion, or they offer wishes for good health. So this entire technology keeps spreading from the south of Spain all the way into other centers in Spain, to a certain extent in southern France, and definitely into Italy. And as the technology evolves, they also begin making lusterware. So just as an aside, I'm showing you a scene from the Alhambra in Granada, which is a 12th century monument, to remind you that in this part of the world, in addition to using ceramics for eating and for ritual vessels and for display, tile making is also a major storyline, and they're making everything the same way. Over time, the Spanish ceramic industry also begins to make lusterware. And that then becomes part of the whole sort of tin glazing story in Europe. The two of the most dramatic examples of this lusterware are what are known as the Alhambra vases. They're known as the Alhambra vases because in the 19th century, some of them were found in the Alhambra. They were also written about by Washington Irving in his tale of the Alhambra. In the 19th century, when they were rediscovered, these became a major storyline in European ceramics and were repeated over and over again. So if you visit European museums, you will see things in this shape. There are 10 vases that are extant today that are known as the Alhambra vases, and there are another handful of fragments in museums around the world that people think were initially part of these vases. The shape itself derives from a very standard storage jar that was found in the Arabic and early Spanish ceramic industries. However, these are so tall, they run between 48 and 55 inches, that the general consensus is that they were intended primarily for display, so that these are not functional vessels. As you can see, they have absolutely gorgeous surfaces with multiple complicated geometric patterns and areas of decoration that tell different things. They also have, for some bizarre reason, these side wings that I can't quite figure out. Very few of them are that stable, so they probably had stands of some sort. This is clearly a later addition. The piece on your left, which is now in the Hermitage Museum in Russia, has two Kufic inscriptions on it, one in the medallions on the upper part of the body and another just below it. Um, the first group of inscriptions basically say pleasure. The second group of inscriptions say health. The jar on your right, which is in the Alhambra, is the most famous of the Alhambra jars. It is called the gazelle jar for the obvious reason that it's decorated with gazelles. Unlike the slightly earlier one that's in the Hermitage, this one is starting to use a great deal of blue, which is a color we'll come back to for our epilogue. The blue is derived from cobalt. Again, beautifully decorated surface, and again, Arabic inscriptions written in the Spanish version of the Kufic script, which basically say good fortune and prosperity over and over and over again. So this technology develops in southern Spain, and then it flows up the Mediterranean coast to multiple Spanish centers, including in Manises, in Valencia, in Barcelona. And all of these centers essentially go through the same technical development that we saw in southern Spain. So you have the green and the blue, purple, or the green and the brown type of ceramic first, and then they begin to paint with the lusterware, and you get these much more complicated surfaces. We can tell from the cross on the mast that this ship is actually probably a Portuguese now, which is a Christian ship, not a Muslim ship. It's shown sailing on the seas with fish underneath, and these little semicircles along the edges can be traced back to Iranian ceramics and glass dating from the 9th to the 10th century. It is painted on a tin glaze with shades of green and brown and cobalt blue, and then glazed again with a luster glaze to make it look more shiny and more metallic. So just to give you a sense of geography, basically this Spanish technology is moving along here, found multiple places in Spain, less in southern France. I spent a lot of time recently visiting small museums, trying to figure out what there was. And then it moves into Italy from both the north and from the south. And one of the major centers for the production of this type of ware is actually Tunis or Tunisia, which, as you can see, is fairly close to Sicily and to Italy itself. So it's kind of moving right along here. And in the late 14th and early 15th century, you have an Italian variant of this ceramic tradition developing. So I'm showing you what's a very fun little, probably drinking vessel that has this delightful little fish painted again, white tin glaze, green and brown colors, and a much more elaborate and slightly later dish, which again was probably intended for display. It's almost 2 feet wide. So that's a little big for daily use. And you can see that it's got these two little holes on the top. And if you look at the back, just to remind you, the clay itself is not the kind of high-fired, beautiful white clay that was coming into the world from China at this time. It's actually a red earthenware. It's low-fired. Earthenware, if you think your basic clay flower pot, that's what earthenware is. And again, it has been made to look like a completely different material by covering it with a tin glaze and then painting it in shades of brown and green. In this case, the story is a very sort of 15th century European story of a courtier riding a horse in a kind of floral background that's not very clear where it's supposed to be. And he's got two letters coming out of his mouth. One is a T and one is an E. And people have speculated that essentially what's going on is that he's saying, I love you, te amo. And this was some kind of a gift from one person to another. Possible, don't know. So just to remind you again, it's moving along the Mediterranean. It's very, very much a Mediterranean story. And we're going to go back to Italy, and we're going to be sort of right underneath Montelupo in Pisa, of Leaning Tower fame. And we're going to talk about one of our byways. So Italy in the 13th, in the 11th to the 14th century, was not the Italy we know today, right? It was not a unified nation. It actually became a country after the United States. It was a series of civic and mercantile centers, which were often in competition with each other. One of those centers was Pisa, which became a major mercantile force in European trade, or in in Mediterranean trade, is probably more accurate, in the 11th century. And as a result, because of all the money that was coming into the city, began to build churches. Now, these Pisan churches, this is, remember, before the tin-glazed tin-glazed Italian industry it has really begun to develop. These Pisan churches are fascinating. We're going to look at two 11th century ones, but we could look at 13th and 14th century ones as well, because they did something very unusual. They are by and large made from a yellow limestone that was found in the area. However, they enhanced this yellow limestone by repurposing Roman columns and other marble pieces of Roman architecture, which they called spolia. And then they further enhanced the surface of these ceramics by sticking ceramics, imported ceramics, on the walls in different locations. So just to look very closely, there is still an imported Islamic ceramic in this niche. There is not one here. There is not one here. There is one here. There is not one here. There is not one here. There is not one here. So this church, which by the way was closed clearly when I visited it, and also has Roman architectural things inside apparently, is called San Zeno. It's an early 11th century church. And all of the ceramics that have been found there are thought to have been made in Tunisia. So basically, these are all imported ceramics. And in the early 11th century, most of the ceramics that were found in Italy seem to have been coming in from Morocco and Tunisia, and only to a small extent from southern Spain. By the late 11th century, different church, San Sisto, you're finding more of these ceramic vessels used to decorate the churches themselves, and they're coming from more places. So San Sisto was concentrated in 1087. Again, we've got our yellow limestone, our Roman columns, and for some bizarre reason, these imported ceramics stuck all the way along the upper facade of the church. So you can see, in this case, they seem to have been placed more deliberately. They seem to have been less random, and they're definitely coming from a broader part of the world. So you see them not only along the surface here, but they were originally in all of these niches along the side of the church. You can see that there are still two here. The ceramics in San Sisto come from Egypt, Tunisia, Morocco, and southern Spain. The question that I've spent most of the summer thinking about is why do this? Obviously, there were ceramics coming up in enough numbers that they were widely available and a church could get their hand on them. And I think by the late 11th century, plan to put these ceramics on the surface. One of the things that people who study this phenomenon, which is known as bacini in Italian, suggest is that it was about polymateriality and wanting to have a kind of different surface effect, so that between the yellow limestone and the white marble and the ceramics that were stuck towards the tops of all the churches, it looked more lively. I have to say, I'm not entirely convinced, but partially that may be because when I was there, it was raining. So they didn't look all that colorful. And if you didn't know that they were there and start to look up for them, it was very difficult to be sure exactly what you were seeing. I don't know that they necessarily catch your eye if you're walking down on ground level, but they did this extensively, particularly in Pisa, from the 11th to the 14th century. And they did it with more and more ceramics imported from more and more parts of the world. So, since the 1970s, they have begun to take these ceramics off these churches and preserve them in a small museum in a convent in Pisa, where they are basically in rooms with early Renaissance paintings. So they have nothing to do with each other. This particular group is all from Sicily. They have studied them. The discovery and rediscovery of these bacini in the Italian churches has helped people learn more about the Tunisian ceramic industry, which is something that we knew nothing about. And over time, Italy becomes the center for these tin glazed wares, which begin to look very, very different. So if you've heard the term maiolica, maiolica means a tin glazed European ceramic, comes from the Islam, technology comes from the Islamic world. The taste for white comes from early China. And the reason that we use the Italian word to discuss this kind of ceramics in European ceramics, as opposed to the Spanish one, is because over time Italy overtook this ceramic industry and became the center for maiolica. Although potters today who are studio potters, who are interested in making ceramics as individual works of art rather than as things for distribution, also sometimes revert to tin glazing as an aesthetic choice. So that's our byway number one. Our byway number two has to do with the development of medicine in Eurasia in the 11th, 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. And one of the things that when we study global trade, we don't always pay attention to is what was traveling with ceramics. So clay, and to a lesser extent textiles, are what allow us to see trade patterns. They allow us to see how things are moving back and forth along the world. But also, of course, there were lots of aromatics and spices and medicinal herbs. For example, rosemary comes into Italy at this point in time, that were becoming more and more available at the same time that public as well as court pharmacies were becoming more known. So I'm showing you a 15th century painting of a pharmacy that's in an illustrated medical treatise that was commissioned by a Jewish merchant for a Catholic convent, which shows a pharmacy with ceramic jars, and a 16th century Turkish painting also with ceramic jars. And in fact, the blending between sort of the spread of these pharmaceuticals and the spread of ceramics is very, very tight because you needed jars to keep things in. I suspect that some of the jars that we're looking at in the Turkish painting are in fact Chinese, by the way. And they developed certain shapes specifically for pharmacies and to hold items. So one of those shapes, which is known as a pharmacy jar or an alburello in Italian, was probably first found in the Islamic world, then ported to Spain, and then transported from Spain to Italy. And if you look at this 15th century Spanish piece and this 15th century Italian piece, you can see that they're both painted with ivory. And ivy was a medicinal herb at this point in time. Should also notice that the Spanish piece uses luster, whereas the Italian piece does not, because they have not gotten to it yet in Italy. And interestingly enough, and just to show you how ubiquitous this all was, this pharmacy jar shape, which probably developed because the sort of indentation in the middle made it easier to pick up and dispense from, became sort of an icon in religious imagery as well. So this is a famous 15th century altarpiece. It's called the Portinari altarpiece. It was commissioned by a merchant for a church in Florence. And if you look at a detail of it, you can see again that we've got our pharmacy jar, exactly the same pharmacy jar with the ivy, as well as a related piece of glass holding flowers that are symbolic of the story, which is the visitation of the shepherds to the newly born Christ child. And this is the reason why, even in Spanish and Italian pharmacies today, you will still find lots of ceramic pots. This is actually the pharmacy at Santa Maria Novella in Florence, which bills itself as the earliest Italian pharmacy in the world, which has wonderful body lotions, and which is still using ceramic pots, and is the church for which the Portinari altarpiece was painted. Okay, so that's our second byway. Now for our epilogue, and I am taking you back to China. So the other thing that develops, and I would argue again that it comes from the taste for white that emerged in the late 6th century, is the addition of cobalt blue to the palette of Chinese ceramics. And you find it first in Sansai, so first in the 3-color glazes, which become the 4-color glazes. You also find it used as a glaze, and you find it used as a pigment. And obviously, once you've got a white surface, it's very, very easy to use that surface as a canvas or a palette and to put lots of colors on it. So blue and white, which is the sort of late 15th and 16th century global ceramic story that we're not going to get to, emerges in China, late 8th, early 9th century, is immediately copied in the Islamic world, again as a result of the development of this tin glazing, which was a response to imported Chinese ceramics. And the use of cobalt continues in the Islamic world and in European ceramics, 9th, 10th, 11th, 12th century, and then begins to flourish in the 15th century. The missing piece is what happens in China, because we definitely have blue and white in the late Tang, and it disappears until the 14th century in the Yuan. And then it takes over the entire Chinese ceramic industry in the 15th and 16th centuries. But why there's no evidence for blue and white in China from the 10th to the 14th century is a problem that occupies my mind all the time. So thank you very much for your attention.
All right. Thank you so much, Denise. So we have a bit of time for questions. So if anybody wants to ask a question, feel free to use the raise hand function, and we'd be happy to call on you to interact directly. Nancy, was that a raised hand there? No. Okay.
I think Shaolin had his hand up, or
Did
maybe
you have a
it's just.
question? Alfredo, go ahead. Amanda, I see you.
Okay, good evening. I'm wondering if there's a region in China where this white clay is more abundant.
Yeah, I thought about that because it's found. Well, no, actually, geologically, the heavy the white clay in the north has a high percentage of kaolin or kaolin. The white clay in the south, they actually add pure kaolin to the material, but it's really found all around the place. I thought a lot about it because it sort of starts late northern Qi, early Sui, and of course there's a move of the capital further east. So my first thought was maybe they had really just found quarries with this kind of clay and they just started using it. But then when you go through enough archaeological journals and you look through enough tombs, you find that some tombs have it and most tombs don't. So that's when I started thinking probably there was some agency or choice that someone was wanting this material. So that's my theory du jour, so to speak.
Thanks, Alfredo. Amanda, go ahead. Oh,
Oh, hello. Thanks. I was having a hard time figuring this out, how to raise my hand. Um,
Too early in the morning.
well, it's late for me. I'm in Singapore, so.
Okay,
But
sorry.
but just about the blue, the
Mhm.
cobalt, because my understanding that's not, it was imported, right? It was imported. So yeah, I mean, I'm just wondering, was China the first to use the cobalt, or
So
I
this is
mean,
one of the things where Chinese archaeology has caused a furor in the field because it has been tested. Remember, I mentioned that now we can do all this scientific testing, and it is a form of cobalt, and it is found in kilns and archaeological sites and shipwrecks in China that are Chinese or material that's Chinese. And so the old storyline that the Chinese had to import cobalt from the Islamic world in order to invent blue and white in the 14th century is definitely being challenged right now. And one of the problems with this is that if you're talking to an Islamicist colleague, they do not like the news story that's coming out of China. So I was talking about blue and white maybe about 8 years ago in Dallas, and a woman literally lost her mind and started screaming at me about John Pope and you know. But the fact is that these are excavated pieces. We know which kilns the cobalt blue was added in initially. We know when they started it, and we know it is a form of cobalt. The imported cobalt is a little less gray and a little more blue. And that does come in under the UN, obviously, with the sort of Pax Mongolica and the fact that you could move stuff around. And the other thing that people are still fussing over is whether, like the dish that I showed you that was in China that was painted, and then the Islamic variant of it. So people will argue, well, those were only made for trade. They reflect foreign taste. But in fact, you have that same blue in three color glazes, which become four color glazes. So I'm not entirely convinced that it was just for foreign taste because the Chinese obviously liked it too. They put it in their sansai. And I don't know, the fun thing about ceramics is you can kind of tell big stories because you're not limited by text, but you also don't have text that prove your point. So,
okay. So
because there are
just
texts
to
that say, and then we
confirm,
start.
there in the ninth, 10th century, there are not blue glazed pieces in the Islamic world or in
There were turquoise glazed ones, but the blue seems to be
turquoise.
a response to the imported Chinese ones. And then it's absolutely nuts
Ah,
because they continue to use it forever and ever and ever. It's all over the place. It's in the lusterwares. Manaiware has it, everybody has it. And it sort of goes away in China and then comes back. And that's part of the argument for foreign taste, because some people will say the Tang was foreign and the yuan was foreign, right? But the Sung was real China. So, but I'm a little uncomfortable with all of those locutions. So
Thanks.
notable
Thanks.
examples, I have to read it. Devin, do you want me to just read the chat?
Uh, I can do it for you. So,
Oh, I'm
Nancy,
not,
okay,
my video camera is on. Did I not do it? Oh,
yeah.
okay. Along the lines of the kerfuffle, where, let me see if I can see this. Any notable examples where something it's not opening up? I'm sorry, I can't see this last chat from Metz
Sure.
N along the
Yeah.
lines of the
So,
kerfuffle.
and I'll read it for everybody else too that's not looking at the chat. Along the lines of the kerfuffle about the origin of cobalt, are there any other notable examples where national identity colors the academic discussion about development of ceramics?
No, not so much. It's the origins of cobalt that really has people getting a little crazy, because for so long it was seen as something that began in one part of the world, and now because of archaeology and scientific testing, you can make an argument for another part of the world. And I think a couple of things have been happening in ceramic history. If you're older and you had the same kind of training I did, you're uncomfortable referring to the early whitewares in China as porcelains. And that's because, well, they have a high percentage of kaolin or kaolin, which is the primary ingredient in porcelain. They're not quite as high fired as the later materials. So East Asian scholars in general just say porcelain now. Um, Older Western scholars are still very uncomfortable. I am not uncomfortable. I think, frankly, if you invented it, you can name it. But there's still some kerfuffling about that. But no, it's the blue and white, because after the story I just told you, right, in the 15th century, they get around the Cape of Good Hope in Africa, and the trade actually becomes more Atlantic and less Mediterranean. And what they're making the most of in China at that time is blue and white. So that then becomes the big storyline in the 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So the origins of blue and white becomes a very contested thing, because it was the computer chips of the early modern world. Essentially, it just transformed eating. The whole idea of eating on a plate comes in the 15th century. The idea of the dining service comes in later on, when people can have sets of porcelain made. I mean, it's a big deal, to put it in a slightly non-academic thing. So there's a question about, can you fill in more about how taste for white is translated as colors? It's not so much that taste for white translated as colors. What I'm suggesting is that once you had the white, the idea that a ceramic could be a palette for a design that was different from the shape of the ceramic is what came in, right? So it's not like other tomb figures aren't painted. So you have these low-fired earthenware figures, and what's painted on them is the clothing or something that's really inherent to the shape of the tomb figure. But by the time you've got this white surface, obviously the temptation to decorate that becomes very strong, and you start decorating it. And it is true that you couldn't have the sansai without the white glazes that were developing earlier with the taste for white. Now, the suggestion that they were looking at Roman glass is, I understand, outrageous, but I have spent a lot of time really thinking about, I mean, what was some guy sitting in a kiln somewhere and he decided to start throwing glazes around to make sansai? I mean, something has to have spurred this, right? Because all of a sudden it just appears in like 675 ish. So,
Can you talk a little bit more about the perhaps the technological shift that happens that allows for white to
so So in order to fire the white clay, you had to fire it at a higher level to get it to bake. And so that spurred, so initially they were, in China, they were also covering things with a white glaze as well as using the white clay. So they did both initially. And then they started using the white clay and the white glaze. When you fire something at a higher temperature, you can start using a thinner glaze. It allows the glaze to join the body of the clay more tightly, and you get something that's stronger and thinner. And as I mentioned earlier, it's more hygienic because it's more like a glass, so it's easier to clean. And if you want to go really argumentatively, I would argue that Chinese whitewares take over the position initially held by Roman glass in Eurasia, and they become the new luxury. But that definitely doesn't fly with very many of my colleagues.
And is there I guess before the white clay becomes popular, is there kind of a trail of people using it in other instances? How does that
No,
become?
it just pops up.
Okay.
So that's why I think the question about was it geography is a really good one, and it's the first one I thought of because it was like, well, they moved the northern Chi capital further into the northeast, right? So I thought maybe they found kilns there or quarries there that had this material, but then it's so clearly a choice, right? Because it's in certain tombs and not in others. And often it's tombs where when you start looking at what they've got, they have this taste for goods that show an awareness of a wider world, essentially. And I do think it's agency or choice or taste or whatever word we want to use there.
Amazing. Amanda in the chat also asks, can you tell us a little bit about the non-invasive testing?
Sure. So when I started in the museum field, if you wanted to see what exactly the chemical composition of the body of a ceramic was, or the chemical composition of a glaze, you had to take a sample, which means that you had to drill into something, and then you could take the sample and you could test the sample. Now there are things like XRF and SIMS and other things where you can literally run the machine over the surface of the ceramic and it will read the chemical footprint and it will give you all this information without you having to take a sample. So anybody who's a museum curator or a conservator is going to have a deep-seated fear of cutting into any work of art that's in their collection, because anytime you're sampling anything, you're putting it at risk, right? So people were not as willing to test. Now you can do this. Now, none of this testing is perfect. For example, the Celadon on the Seas book, we tested everything in Yale's collection. And I thought for sure that that would help me tell the difference between something from Fujian and something from Guangzhou. It did not. So I think the geology of southern China is incredibly consistent. But every once in a while, it can give you a lot of information. One of the things we know is that even though I'm still using the term tin glazing, because that's been used in the scholarship for so long, tin was not the only opacifier used in Islamic ceramics now. And that's helping us sort of say, well, this one was made in Iraq and this one was made in Iran. And we don't know where this one was made because the things moved all the time. So, and I'm sorry I didn't turn my computer on so you could see my face. I thought it was more important to see the pretty pictures, but
Oh, I think that
next
was
time
just
I'll leave my screen on too.
no,
So,
I think it was fine. I think it was sort of asking everybody else to also turn on their computers, their cameras.
okay.
Let me see. We've got one more question in the chat. The sancai is also used on sculptures, horses, ladies, gods, monsters, which I'm guessing is different from Roman glass. So is the trail from Roman glass cups and plates then to sancai cups and plates and then to the sculptures?
I think what if I'm right, and I think visually it's quite convincing. It was more that they were looking at the effect. The thing about sansai is that the storyline is that basically it was a funerary good, and it's absolutely true that it was found primarily in tombs. But then again, when you're talking that early in the history of any place, you are often looking at archaeological sites. They have found some sansai in some of the palaces in Xi'an, and it has been excavated in other parts of the world. So I'm not entirely sure that it was a primarily funerary thing. Certainly, the first evidence for it is the 675 is actually because of a tomb that's dated to that time period. And as you know, because of the epitaph tablets and everything, we usually have a lot of information about Chinese tombs, right? So we know when the burial occurred and who's in it and all that kind of stuff. Clearly was very much an elite royal material initially, so it's definitely found in the Xi'an area or Luoyang, but not so much elsewhere. But they have found, they found excavated pieces in Korea. They found excavated pieces in Japan. There's something called Nara Sansai, which is the Japanese trying to copy the Chinese Sansai. And very few rare examples have been found in West Asia as well. So I think that's another thing where the storyline probably needs to be nuanced. And as I pointed out, they were copying it in the Islamic world at some point. And that's why I said waves, because I don't necessarily think it's a straight line, but people were aware of each other and they were copying each other and responding to each other. And then, the big outstanding issue that everyone talks about is whether potters were moving. Because there was this battle at Talis in 751. And initially, when people looked at the development of whitewares in Iraq and Iran, they assumed Chinese potters had come to do it. But that's an assumption. There's virtually no evidence. And then as the green and magnesium, or the Velde and Magnesio technology spread through Europe, there's a lot of argument as to whether or not Spanish potters were moving around. And could a potter in Italy, looking at something that was made in Spain or the Islamic world, tell, just because of their knowledge of pottery, how it was made? Or, were these top secret glazes that somehow had to be transmitted? That's just something that people speculate on, but there's no written data to hang your hat on. So people can argue it either way. And it's entirely possible. I mean, we have evidence later on for people moving textile artists around under the Mongols. So they could have moved potters around. I just don't know. Or potters could have fled areas of warfare and tried to move somewhere else, right?
Can you tell us something about the kilns that were used, the kind of the materials they used to get that heat?
Yeah, so the early Arabic kilns are single boxes, and there's a heat source underneath them, and then there's the sort of chamber in the top. Whereas the Chinese, as you know, invented the dragon kiln. So one of the reasons for China's preeminence has to do with the fact that they could fire so many more pots, right? Because a single chamber kiln, you're only going to get so many things out of it at any given time. Whereas if you've got this long mountain of a kiln, you can certainly put more things in. And we know certainly from later work on ceramics that where something is in the kiln affects how well it fires. And so sometimes it's possible that new effects were developed because, something misfired and then people liked the way it looked and then they tried to recreate it.
Or what about the fuel?
It was generally wood and or coal, depending on the area and what they could find. And sometimes kilns switched back and forth. And now that we're looking at the environment more critically from a historical perspective, there have been suggestions made that when a kiln complex moved from one place to another, it's literally because they used up all the natural materials in the initial place and had to move. And that does make sense to me. But I don't I don't know exactly for every kiln what the material was, honestly. So
Could you could you tell us something about the relationship between white clay and kaolin? Are they often found close together?
yes, so often if a clay is white, it's got the kaolin in it. So the difference is the percentage of the kaolin. So the term sometimes used for the early whitewares is secondary kaolin. But by the time you get to the piece that the alumni just gave us, which is very, very thin, that's a porcelain. I mean, it just is. You know, it even bings when you do this to it, which of course we would never do, but we might have before Yale owned it at a dealer's. So, yeah, no, it's just kaolin is what makes something white, right? A pure white, and that's why they had to create the tin glazing because they didn't have the clay that could burn white in a way. So that if you want the white or the off-white, you have to do something else. Also, if you look at if you remember some of those Islamic ceramics are in the gallery, and if you come and look at them and you look at them very carefully, you'll see that they're almost all cracked, and we've had to put them back together. And that's because even though they were getting the appearance of the white Chinese clay, it didn't have the strength because the clay wasn't as plastic. It was much more friable, so it broke more easily. So it's very rare for early Islamic ceramics in any museum anywhere not to be showing signs of repair. And in fact, if you ever find a perfect piece, you might want to consider being suspicious about its authenticity. Does that help?
Yes.
Thank you.
I'm calling from Venezuela, and
Oh,
there's an yes, there's an oral tradition among the Amerindians here in the Amazon of a kind of porcelain that was used centuries ago. I'm wondering if there's
huh.
kaolin, white clay in other parts of the world that you know about.
I don't know other than the parts of the world I've studied. Now the only thing I can add to that is that if we were talking about the blue and white story, I could tell you that the tin glazing in Spain went from Spain to Mexico, and it is in Mexico in the late 15th, 16th, and 17th century that the first North American copies of Chinese porcelain were made. So in a place called Talavera de la Reina, which is named for a city just south of Madrid, which is where blue and white became a big deal in Spain. But it's actually, as I was, I've been thinking about this for quite a while now. As I was traveling through Europe this summer, I realized that the story I told you is kind of a Mediterranean story. And then, as I mentioned, it becomes an Atlantic story. And when it becomes an Atlantic story, it's a blue and white story, which is why I then start fussing about what happened to blue and white in China from the 10th to the 14th century. Like nothing, because it's not like they didn't know about cobalt because they have it in their sansai places, right? So just don't know. I keep expecting an archaeological site to find all these 12th century blue and whites, and then we'll figure it out. But they haven't yet, so, or as far as I know, because I may not have noticed yet, but I think I would have.
Maybe we'll do one last question from the chat, related to this blue and white, which is, could it be that it was just a matter of aesthetics and
Mhm.
that they just didn't find it attractive at that time?
Yeah, I think that's probably the best answer because when you get to the Sung, they go back largely at the more elite levels of ceramics to the monochrome glazes. So tastes change in every culture all the time, and so that was it. Or it could be that because of the fact that it was found primarily in a burial setting, it was seen as not as desirable for eating and drinking. Whereas a beautiful green glaze bowl or a pure white or something would be seen as more appealing. Quite possible.
Well, we look forward to having the next talk when you solve this mystery. Um,
I'll let you know when I solve it. Yeah,
but thank you again for a fantastic, engaging talk. And thank you, everybody, for joining us from all over the world.
great.
Um, I think it's fitting that this story of ceramics that you're telling is a international, global one, and that we have so many people from all over the world also joining us to hear this story.
Great. So thank you everybody for coming.
Take care, everybody. Feel free to unmute yourself to say thank you. All right. Thank you so
Okay,
much, and we'll see you next time.
great. Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.